Jim Thorpe is the greatest athlete in U.S. history, and he has also been the victim of a monstrous injustice for the last 110 years. An injustice which, at long last, has been fully rectified as of yesterday. And when a monstrous injustice is done to an American legend and it gets wiped from the record, when truth and decency win the day, when we see evidence that the arc of history really does bend toward justice, even if it sometimes takes a frustratingly long time to get there, that is the sort of thing that we like to celebrate on this program. If you're unfamiliar with the story, Jim Thorpe represented the United States at the 1912 Olympic Games in Stockholm, where he competed in the decathlon and the classic pentathlon. There were two versions of the pentathlon in those days, but more on that in a moment. He wins both events in fairly dominant fashion, collects his gold medals, and sails home to enjoy the acclaim and notoriety that accompany being a multi-event Olympic champion. At least that's the way it should have gone, and I suppose it did go that way, but only for about 6 months, up until the day Jim Thorpe receives a letter from the IOC that says, "Please surrender your medals. You're not an Olympic champion anymore." And what scandalous thing had Jim Thorpe done to be the recipient of such treatment? Well, he played semi-pro baseball for parts of 2 seasons in 1910 and 11. Semi-pro in the sense of, come out and play for our ball club here, and if the gate receipts are big enough on the day, then we'll pay you enough to maybe cover your meals and lodging. But if it's a light crowd, you don't get anything. Needless to say, semi-pro baseball in the first decade of the 20th century was not a thing that a young man did because he was trying to make a fortune at it. It was a way whereby you could hopefully make enough of a meager income to avoid living on the street and starving to death. For all intents and purposes, it was just a slightly more classy version of being a day laborer, except that the day laborer is usually guaranteed to get paid something, whereas the semi-pro ball player is not. And for people who only know sports as they have existed in recent decades, it is impossible to convey to them just how rigidly enforced the rules used to be around amateurism in sport. I think there's a common perception today that mandating amateurism back then had something to do with honoring the spirit of friendly competition, but that's a bunch of bullshit. They used to enforce amateurism so they could keep working class people from being able to compete. It was very important to the men who ran sports in those days that the only competitors on the field should be gentlemen, in the sense of the word that means that you're able to make all of your income collecting rents from your estate, so you're able to devote all of your time to playing sports and other such leisure activities. The last thing that these men ever wanted was to open up their playing fields to a bunch of farmhands and factory workers, or God forbid, Indians. So as long as there was an amateurs-only rule in place and it was strictly enforced, there was no threat of anybody from the unwashed rabble taking a spot away from a member of the wealthy elite. It was that way in golf, it was that way in tennis, and it was especially that way in the Olympics. In the sports that had gone professional by that point, which means baseball in the US and association football in the UK, being a pro athlete was considered something of a disreputable profession, much like prostitute and actor. There is another common perception that says Jim Thorpe was persecuted and stripped of his medals due to prejudice against American Indians. But was it because of his race? Or was it because he was viewed as an interloper from the lower classes who was not a proper gentleman? Would the persecution have looked any different if he was the son of Irish or Italian immigrants? I don't think there's any reason to assume that. It's true that Jim Thorpe dealt with a lot of really shitty racism in his life, but I also think it's a lazy, reductive reading of history to just blame the whole thing on racism and then call it a day. Two things can both be true at once, and the most likely version of the real truth in this case is that racism and class prejudice were both equal ingredients in this particular cocktail of injustice. And it has to also be said that any defense of Jim Thorpe has to acknowledge that according to the letter of the law, he did break the amateurism rule, and his claims of having done it unwittingly are not particularly credible. He wrote a letter to the Olympic Committee saying basically, look, I'm just a dumb Indian from the reservation. I didn't know any better. And look, if he was lying and playing dumb in order so he might avoid losing his medals, I don't think there's much shame in that at all. Jim Thorpe knew his personal brand was going to be damaged a great deal if he went from being two-time Olympic champion to guy who cheated and got his medals taken away. So if I'm in his position, I'm going to lie my ass off too, and I'm not going to feel guilty about it for one moment. But in his defense, a few other things are also pretty clear from the historical record. Number one, that the Olympic officials, both in New York and in Paris, knew about the semi-pro baseball thing beforehand, and they allowed him to compete anyway. Number two, that other competitors at the Stockholm Games had done the exact same thing and didn't have their medals stripped. And number three, the IOC rules of the day said any eligibility protest had to be lodged within 30 days of the end of the Games, which is a lot less than 6 months. So in the final analysis, by the letter of the law, everybody is in the wrong. Jim Thorpe was ineligible and shouldn't have been allowed to compete, but once he did compete and won, and 30 days had gone by, his wins and his eligibility should have been unreviewable. In 1982, over 20 years after the man's death, they attempted a sort of half-measure solution where they restored Thorpe's gold medals, but took the additional step of declaring that the second-place finishers were also co-gold medalists, which is just stupid, you know. Maybe you guys are losing sight of who actually won the event on the day because it was not a tie. So this was just pretty insulting to everybody, basically, as attempted half-measure solutions often are. But Jim Thorpe's advocates never gave up. They never stopped applying pressure. And that is to their eternal credit. For yesterday, 14 July 2022, the International Olympic Committee declared that Jim Thorpe of Lincoln County, Oklahoma, is the true, rightful, and only winner of the decathlon and the classic pentathlon at the 1912 Stockholm Games. I still want to talk about the other pentathlon, but I am running out of opening segment here, so let's do it on the other side, Mr. Eagle, if you please. From high atop the battlements of Castle Curmudgeon, where we are doing our part for climate change by burying the corpses of our enemies rather than burning them. Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. America, and all ships at sea. Welcome to the program. I am your eponymous host and humble servant. So there's two versions of the pentathlon that are contested at the 1912 Olympics. The one they called the classic pentathlon, the one that Jim Thorpe competed in, was the same one they used to do back in the ancient Greek Olympics, where it was meant to be a test of the basic skills that a soldier in those days was supposed to possess. So you've got long jump, javelin, 200-meter dash, discus, and 1,500-meter run. But then Pierre de Coubertin, the founder of the modern Olympic movement, he has a thought. He says, well, why not have a modern version of this thing too, where instead of approximating the skills of an ancient Greek soldier, we're approximating the skills of a modern cavalryman from the turn of the 20th century. So they kept the long running event. They actually doubled it to 3,000 meters. But in the other 4 slots, they put fencing, swimming, horse riding, and pistol shooting. Now, the 1912 Games marked the first ever appearance of the modern pentathlon in the Olympic program, and the only competitor sent by the United States to compete in the event was a taciturn 27-year-old Army captain by the name of George Smith Patton, Jr., whom you may know better as General George Patton, as he later became, terror of North Africa, conqueror of Sicily, liberator of Bastogne, pain in Eisenhower's ass, the man who cared so much about his men that he went to the hospital to personally slap the PTSD right out of them. So they do the pistol shooting event first. Patton finishes in 20th place, but for the rest of his life, and perhaps not unreasonably, he believes that he really won the thing. Now, since this event was dreamed up by one guy, and this was the first time it had ever been contested, it hadn't occurred to anybody that there should be a rule saying all the competitors had to use the same type of pistol. So in the event, since these guys were all cavalry officers, they just each used their Army-issue sidearm, which for everybody else in the field was a .22, but for George Patton it was a .38. Because we are America, damn it, and we win every dick measuring contest we are in, especially when it's a dick measuring contest with guns. But here's the problem. Each contestant has to take all of his shots at the same paper target, and Patton's 38 rounds are tearing some fearsome holes in this thing, to the point where his last shot goes through one of the holes from his other previous shot. But since the judges aren't able to find a hole for every round he shot, they decide they have got no choice but to rule that he missed the target entirely on the last shot, which would have been totally inconceivable. Patton was the best pistol shooter in the U.S. Army, and nobody would have argued the point. He could have shot standing on his head with his eyes closed and not missed the target completely. To put it another way, Patton had every reason to be pissed as hell at this point, and they are only one event into this thing. The swimming event comes next, and though Patton is a native Southern Californian, an adept swimmer he is not. In fact, he has to put in a lot of practice in the weeks leading up to the games because he's afraid he might drown in public otherwise. So how does he do in the race? He finishes in 7th. So after 2 events, he's standing in a 4-way tie for 11th place. Next comes the fencing competition, and this is one of Captain Patton's signature events. Just as he's the finest pistol shooter in the Army, he also likes to think he's the best swordsman, and in addition to being the designer of the 1913 Patton cavalry saber, which most of the people who are experts on such things say is the finest weapon that has ever been built for slashing motherfuckers to death while riding a horse. And yes, obviously, it's completely absurd that somebody was designing a new cavalry saber the year before the First World War broke out. But how is he supposed to know it would be a thing that became instantly obsolete? He finishes 4th in the fencing, and he's disappointed with that because swordplay is not an area in which George Patton likes to be bested by anybody. But he has moved himself up to 8th place through 3 events behind 6 Swedes and an Englishman. The home country had a hell of a lot of dudes in this field, is all I'm saying. The equestrian event comes next, and this is another one where Patton, who wants to show that he's the finest cavalryman in the whole wide world, feels like he should have a good chance at winning. But he winds up finishing 6th. The top 5 are 4 Swedes and a Finn, who are all on their home turf riding their own horses. In other words, Patton had the best finish of anybody who had to compete on a borrowed mount. But he continues moving himself up the leaderboard. He's in 6th place overall now, the highest ranked competitor in the field who is not from the host country. The running event comes last, and Patton pretty much has got to win the thing in order to finish in the medals, and though distance running is not one of his athletic strengths, he runs this race so hard he nearly puts himself into an early grave. He comes in 3rd, 1 minute, 1 second behind the winner, and then immediately collapses unconscious on the track and has to be carried into the trainer's room to be resuscitated. Now, if Patton had been scored properly in that first event, the shooting event, and received credit for the shot that passed through the previous hole rather than being penalized for having missed the target altogether, he wins the gold medal, and it's not close. But in the actual event, he finishes in 5th place, in the middle of a sea of Swedes, 3 ahead, 2 behind. Hell, even if he had just had the opportunity of riding his own horse in the equestrian event instead of a borrowed one, he might have won the gold even in spite of the scoring error on the shooting range. So needless to say, Jim Thorpe was not the only 1912 U.S. pentathlete who had good reason to think he had been screwed. And it seems to have been well understood, even by his own competitors at the time, that Patton was the guy who had performed best overall and should have been the winner. Now, George Patton, as you know, was a legendarily irascible man who held grudges easily and often never let them go. So there is no possible way that he was not really pissed off about this. So what did he say at the end of the competition? When the press comes up and asks him for comment, this is what he said, quote, "The high spirit of sportsmanship and generosity manifested throughout speaks volumes for the character of the officers of the present day. There was not a single incident of a protest or any unsportsmanlike quibbling or fighting for points, which I may say marred some of the other civilian competitions at the Olympic Games. Each man did his best and took what fortune sent him like a true soldier, and at the end we all felt more like good friends and comrades than rivals in a severe competition. Yet this spirit of friendship in no manner detracted from the zeal with which we all strove for success." Try to picture yourself at age 27. You have just been screwed out of an Olympic gold medal. Everybody knows you've been screwed out of an Olympic gold medal. They come up and ask you to sum up your feelings on the record for all of posterity. And can you imagine giving a statement of such class and magnanimity? Try to think of any current-day athlete in a similar situation, taking the high road and not uttering a single word of complaint. You can't picture it, can you? Because it's inconceivable. Today's athletes, by and large, are thin-skinned egomaniacs whose central character traits are malignant narcissism and unwarranted self-importance. And speaking of malignant narcissism and unwarranted self-importance, the Vice President of the United States is in the news today, Kamala Harris, the Ugandan headhunter, the California cackler, the woman who did for word salad what Hidden Valley did for ranch dressing. It seems the Vice President's chief speechwriter is leaving her job, someone named Kate Childs Graham, after a mere 4 months, and she's being replaced by a woman with the exceedingly unfortunate name of Megan Groob. And when Megan quits, they'll probably have to just start dragging in homeless people off the street. Hey, would you like to write speeches for the Vice President? No? I mean, thanks for the offer and all, but I think I'd prefer to just keep living under a bridge and doing hand jobs for crack, all things considered. Seriously, can you imagine a worse job in the entire universe than writing speeches for Kamala Harris, even if you manage to write a really good speech? Since even a blind squirrel finds an acorn some days. Will it matter? Will it be able to overcome the Vice President's stupendous hopelessness as a practitioner of the oratorical arts? Between the dead-eyed delivery, the up-talking, the croaky voice, the relentlessly condescending tone, what difference does it make if the words are any good or not? By the time she gets done reluctantly reading out the speech as if she's got some better place to be, some more important thing to be doing, it is a bad speech no matter what happens to be written on the teleprompter screen. And it is a singular achievement, in my judgment, to be even more intensely unpopular than the president with the lowest approval rating since Truman right after he fired MacArthur. That is a true story. Feel free to look it up. But Kamala Harris, amazingly, has managed to make herself even less popular than President and semi-animated cadaver Joe Biden. So now we've got the cringe-inducing spectacle of Gavin freaking Newsom dropping by the White House to measure the drapes while Joe's out of town. Do you think it's safe to say the Democrats are in an unenviable position politically when they are desperately looking for a way to get rid of their incumbent president and their incumbent vice president, and they have got no better fallback option than the absolute worst governor in the United States of America? And I can't imagine Hillary was very happy about seeing Gavin sniffing around the White House like that, stealing her act, circling like a vulture, ready to pounce on that roadkill carcass that used to be the Biden-Harris administration. Maybe the two of them should just settle things in a special pay-per-view steel cage match with all of the proceeds going to help buy Joe Biden some training wheels for his bicycle. And I think with that we will call it a week. Dear viewer, thank you very much indeed for watching. Have a pleasant tomorrow and a delightful, edifying weekend. I will see you Monday. Until then, do not comply. Get off my lawn.